I should introduce my co-author, Cesar Chavez. Please stand up and tell us about your experiences organizing in the California before you. No, but seriously, we're here together as a team. I'm really delighted to be back here, though, because I haven't been here for a long time. In fact, the last time I was here, IFS was in a different building, and we would walk downstairs from across the street of the economics building. So I was really shocked a little bit to see how upscale you've gotten. So anyway, so I want to build on a theme actually that was partly discussed in the previous paper. There was no coordination, but there's certainly a lot of overlap, and but it is also a combination of two papers. So if it's a little bit disconnected, then I apologize, but it does represent both old work and ongoing work, and so there is some disjunction, and it'll be clear as I speak where the disjunction occurs. I don't need to give you any background. We've all worked on these questions of intergenerational mobility, and a lot of the papers have already made the point that the early models, Becker and Tomes, even the earlier work by sociologists on these questions, were very simplified and abstracted from a lot of interesting economics. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I forgot to turn this on. Yes. Yeah, okay. Here. Hello? Yes, there we go. So I'm going to go in the same route as others and try to look at how to build a more general model and so forth. So I'm not going to, I will just simply say that if you look at the early papers in this literature on the IGE, there was a tremendous amount of emphasis on measurement error, especially in the Becker-Tomes paper, when they were talking about mobility being very high, and they were looking at annual earnings year to year. There was a lot of measurement error on annual earnings, and therefore you got a very low IGE, which sounded good. However, as people corrected for measurement error, it went on. But the other issue that got a lot of attention, and I think is mistaken, and I do want to correct in part, is this question of alignment error. And that somehow people, because of the way we write down a lot of economic models as stationary, that we want to somehow align the age of the father and the age of the son. And it typically was stated in that term in the early days, father and son. And the assumption of stationarity is clearly wrong, as many people have said today. And so that was an issue which I want to address, and we will have a way to address that question. And it makes a difference because there really are strong cohort trends, and especially in achievement of education, change in status. I'll show you some data in a minute. And there was another question which also arose if you read Becker and Tomes and the papers derived from it, which is how do you measure luck? And so how do we know what are the unanticipated shocks? And finally, and this came up on several talks today, the question of the policy environment, both the aggregate environment and the micro environment. They're really integrated into the studies of IGE. And so we develop a framework where we can start doing that anyway, but I can't say it's completely satisfactory in the outset. So I'll show you what we've done. So in other words, in the previous work, there's a lot of uncertainty, notions even about stages within the life cycle were ignored. If you know, go back to Becker and Tomes, there were a period of childhood, a period of adulthood, a period of retirement, 3 generations, but in each of those segments were really kind of one period. And there's, of course, a lot of dynamics that goes on in that environment and in the environment, and we need to allow for that. And the other issue was very important, was that most of the transfers people considered were monetary transfers as a measure of parental influence. And there were one parent, one child families, although we heard some discussion how to modify that, partially anyway. And credit constraints were typically ignored, but then were later developed and have been developed extensively in the literature. So what I want to talk about today is what we're doing, and I hope in a constructive way, to recognize the powerful role of family parental influence, parental education, parental structure, and so forth. And if you go back to the original Becker-Tomes model, you realize that the parental influence model there was really directly through this either genetic transmission, assumed to be an AR1 process, or a model that was essentially money transfers. It turns out that other aspects of the family make a difference. In the work I did with Flavio and with Pedro, we had models in which we had introduced education as a determinant. It sounds very simple. It wasn't there before, and it does make a difference. And you'll see, actually, it makes quite a difference in the mediation analysis I'm going to present. So what I want to consider then is that income, not only do we have then richer family structures, but we also want to understand that the income realized is not the income that has acted on. So there's a real question about what are agents acting on? What's the relevant information they're using, or the relevant constraint that they perceive when they're making investments in their children and making decisions, as opposed to what actually happens at the end of life or after some period of realization. So the difference between ex ante and ex post, classic distinction, is really not so present in much of the literature. So we want to try to incorporate that into the literature, into our analysis today. And of course, there really isn't a single IGE. People are so used to running regressions of some one object on another. But of course, there really are different stages for both the parent and the child. And we might link those stages, and we do in part. And you can see, I mean, data limit us from being completely general. But so we can model family environments and their changes to measure IGEs. So let me just talk what I've already argued about this point, so I'm not going to develop that. We want to consider age-specific life cycle profiles of social mobility that are most predictive of child outcomes. So this is an auxiliary analysis instead of just doing an IGE. We want to consider how these measures that we think of as life cycle predictive measures are themselves predicting choices, are predicting outcomes of the children through parental investment and parental exchanges. And then I want to consider, and one of the things we consider in this paper is a range of proxy measures for lifetime resources. We all speak in terms of permanent income, and there's no question that there is some notion of a lifetime concept, but there are multiple concepts in the literature that are used. And what we consider in this paper is a full catalog of different measures that have traditionally been used, and new measures that we create to essentially try to look at not the IGE, but also not just the IGE, but also the prediction of what child outcomes are like when children are adults. And so what we want to argue is that if we use what I would consider stronger life cycle measures, better life cycle measures, let's call it that way, that what we find is that the mobility across life cycle is much less than has been perceived in terms of these proxy measures. So the proxy measures overstate relative mobility, but they understate absolute mobility. And so it's quite interesting. And when we, in a partial attempt to integrate credit market developments and labor market developments, we can see they play an important role in explaining the IGE. So I should say, and I should have said at the beginning, because it complements Eileen's paper that we just heard, we're analyzing data from Denmark. And the point that we are really motivated by is that in a generous welfare state with substantial social benefits and social insurance, there's still strong dependence in lifetime resource and welfare across generations. But we saw that already in the previous paper. So I think this is something that we need to be careful about. This is what motivated me. One thing, Rasmus Landerso and I wrote a paper some years ago, and the results hold up, and we're doing further work in this area. But what we found is when we sort of looked at social mobility in the United States and looked at comparable measures in Denmark, what we found that with the IGE that the social mobility rates in Denmark were comparable to those in the United States, which shocked a lot of people. Certainly a lot of people in Denmark, and some have strongly disagreed. I disagree with the disagreements, but that's not the talk today. Nonetheless, there really are strong ties intergenerationally. And so the question is, what's going on there? And the reason why that's relevant, at least interesting to Americans, is that Denmark is perceived to be the Garden of Eden. If you look at Bernie Sanders, for example, he himself uses the term Garden of Eden and says, well, you have free tuition, you have universal health care, teachers are paid more or less the same, unlike what's going on in the US. In many dimensions, and childcare is very generous. And so there are features of the Danish state which make it look like an ideal. And so it's interesting to us anyway that the IGEs are so comparable and that the nature of social mobility is so similar. So it suggested something other than just aggregate welfare state policies are at work and explaining social mobility. So what I want to talk about is mainly two measures, two different frameworks for measuring life cycle IGEs. One is going to be based on expected present value, and the second is a lifetime approximate value function. And we have evidence from both. And I'll talk mostly about the life cycle PV because they're easy to understand and calculate, and we're in the middle of developing a better way to estimate the expected value functions. But I do want to look at both. So these are measures of lifetime transmission of welfare, not just the transfer of disposable income or consumption or some of the proxy measures. But we want to consider then the evidence on non-stationarity, its importance and how it affects the estimates, and to compare these IGEs based on different measures that are used to proxy lifetimes. So, and consider mediators and decomposing the IGE into major components, similar to what was done here in the previous talk. So these are the two measures we're going to use, and let me just briefly define them. Some of this comes from an earlier work, as I mentioned, but the present discounted value of future income is an expected discounted value, and it can be both expected and realized components, and we look at both. And then a notion about lifetime wealth, which would be the lifetime value function. But there are some issues of approximating that, and we'll discuss that. Ex ante and ex post. And so we're looking at this. So we're looking at registers from Denmark over a fairly long period of time. And we're confining ourselves to Danish natives. So that's going to be a measure. So these are the traditional measures that are used in the literature. And you can correct me if I've missed something. But basically, the traditional measures are there, the first 9. When people look at wage income, income with transfers, disposable income, household consumption, equivalized family measures, and so forth and so on. The various papers in the literature look at these measures. We want to add to that expected present discounted value, realized present discounted value, and then we also want to look at equivalized lifetime measures. So we want to look at a measure which essentially is allowing for family structure and how much wealth will accrue, and then looking at the issue of splintered families and the lifetime contribution of individuals to the contribution of the individuals who formerly were a union to the welfare of their children following the dissolution of the union. So what we want, first of all, the present discounted value is a tool that mainly I'm going to talk about today. The key here is mostly getting long-term data on the information on the Y, the future income, and that would be the income of the household. And that would include not just earnings, it would include things having to do with capital income and having to do with all kinds of realized welfare state policies that would build into the Y. And then the key, and this is something that we're very much addressing here, and it's an IFS topic. Richard has worked on this a lot, and so I'm anxious to hear his feedback. Developing the information set for individual I. And so the individual here can be family unit, and there'll be different family units considered. There's a second notion, though, which we do develop, and it's a way which it's nice, it's kind of simple, but it has a certain flexibility, but creates certain problems. So we'll get to the problems. But one is the expected lifetime wealth. We look at the realized income, and we estimate this by the stochastic discount factor. And this stochastic discount factor, defined as SIT, this is following a paper by Huggett and Kaplan some 10 years ago now. But with using much richer data and using data actually, but this is the same idea. And that is basically that we know we might have an estimates of beta, but we also have estimates of consumption. And we could, if we do have data on consumption, which we do, as a matter of fact, micro surveys on consumption, we can also then form this ratio if we take a position on what the marginal utility of consumption happens to be. And so we're going to allow then, in principle, if we knew observed consumption, to allow for credit constraints, to allow for a lot of different aspects of household behavior. And we also going to include, obviously, demographics, family structure, policy, and so forth in the information set of the agent that we think the agent acts on. So first of all, just formally, if we allow for budget constraints, we can write down the household Euler equation. That's a standard equation. But we're not going to be directly estimating the Lagrange multiplier on those constraints. We are going to have data is bypass it by looking at consumption realized and give us a sense of how far the marginal utility deviates. But to take a position on that, we need to look at the CRRA utility function, which can estimate their independent estimates of rho from survey data, from experiments on Danish populations and so forth. And we can modify the utility function by a vector of a function of demographics, family structure, and the like. So that's kind of the general notion. We're not estimating the value function directly, and that's an issue that it could be important. Costas, I think, actually did that in his paper with Chiapperi. You do have a version of that, but that has some limitations relative to this. We can go on about that, but we do have more dynamics maybe than you had, and so forth and so on. So anyway, the question first, this is something I think most people in this building or most people, maybe not in the building, but in this floor or wherever the floor is located, know something about identifying information sets. And so this is something Richard has worked on, something I worked on, some work I did with Flavio and with Salvador Navarro some years ago now, where we can basically then test whether or not we have a relevant information set by asking whether or not, if we look at some future outcome, whether or not a residual that predicting current outcome is actually predicting future outcome, but its residual is not predicting current outcome, current income. So we can actually then look at what relevant information sets are. So the correct information set is the property that these future forecasts are not predicted by IT. It's not in the information set, but it's realized. If you look at it closely, you realize it's a version of Sims' non-causality test, but I'll just leave it at that. And so we can use these residuals and these innovations that occur as instruments for future values of income and the measures of IGE. And we do this sequentially to correct for endogeneity of the baseline measures of the IGE. So that's one thing. So we can determine the information sets, but for us, the information sets are going to be very general. Not just shocks that occur, imposition of shocks that occur to the earnings functions or to equations of, for example, also labor market shocks due to unemployment and so forth, but to a number of other things related to demographic shocks, births, deaths, divorce, shocks related to policy implications. And in Denmark, there are a large variety of policy variations, some of which affect the housing market and will have implications, including the amount of down payment required for a house and so forth. So these various reforms in the labor market, various reforms in the housing market, the lending market as well have implications which can feed through, at least in the lifetime welfare calculation. And that's why we use those forms. So I don't know if I have to go over this in great detail, but it's basically saying we do have these measures of uncertainty that we can actually realize. And so, for example, the simplest way to go forward, and that's not the only way, but it's one way, is we can use, for example, kind of log earnings processes, or earnings shocks would be both on earnings and maybe asset income. We could have a whole stack of these vectors of income processes. But the typical procedure in the literature has been to do something like this. say, okay, here's the log income plus a fixed effect or something, and then allow for an autoregressive process, ARMA process and epsilon IT. We can then allow for something like a House model, a John House type model, where you have random growth. Gouvenin has worked on that. And there are other general shocks that go back to some of the early work by McCurdy and so forth. But the question that's always been bothering me, and I think others too in this room, is exactly this epsilon. Is that really known or not known to the agent? And whether or not it's a residual from an income process has nothing to do with what's in the information set. And so we want to be able to do those kinds of Sims type causality tests to determine whether it's in information that's set or not. So instead of assuming those shocks are known or some portion are known, we can, and goodness if it won't tell us anything. What we can do is actually chart out. And so we actually do that. And without getting into a lot of detail, but just to presage what some of the results will be. When we take the Danish population, we can look at the residuals, we can look at innovations, things that occur from an information set, say at age 30, and say, what are the innovations that occur if I look at age 50 realizations, which I have. In that case, what I can do then with trying out among different candidate information sets, and that's the Z1, Z2, Z3, we can find out whether those residuals are predictive or not predictive. And the Z3 prediction set essentially passes a test. And I would just say we have thousands and thousands of observations. So using the standard kind of p-values that are used in this literature, which probably shouldn't be used, given the fact you have thousands of observations, and you really should be equalizing type 1 and type 2 errors. But put that to the side, we do find that we do have, quote, a good information set. So let me leave it at that. And this is the specifics of the information set. Yes, please.
Yes, this presupposes for consumption, the absence of borrowing constraints that you were bringing up earlier. And that
No.
For example, I knew that by age 50, my earnings were going to go up, but I was borrowing constrained.
Oh, with perfect certainty, I knew that my earnings were going up. Yes.
But I was borrowing constrained. Kind of all the earnings growth between now and that point in the future, it wouldn't be predictive of children's outcomes if the borrowing constraint did bind.
No, could be highly predictive. I mean, that's a different point from this, what column 3 is saying. But if I know, this is the problem I was mentioning earlier, that in fact, I could be heavily constrained against borrowing against my future income. I can't get my hands on it, right? That's the point, right? So that would not be so predictive, would it? I mean, I know it's going to be there, and I would do everything in my power to try to alleviate it through labor supply and some other actions, but I wouldn't. I couldn't. I mean, under the assumption you're making, I don't think I could act on it today, but in the future I could when I know it. So the question is, what's in the agent's information set, right? So maybe I'm missing your question there.
Yeah, it's just I thought that the original setup it had a little bit of a look of for consumption itself. I can fully appreciate that.
Or education or any other choice, asset choice. It doesn't have to be consumption, but consumption's convenient. Yeah.
Yeah, just that the income realizations, how predictive that's going to be depends not only on whether I know about future income, but whether I can act on it through borrowing constraints.
Right. No, there's a sense in which you can say all of these tests are going to be arguing the following. They're going to be arguing, suppose that I'm completely irrational and I know exactly what's future, but I don't use that information. Then that wouldn't affect my choice. I'm not using it. I'm just completely irrational. So in the sense that I'm completely constrained and can't act on anything, yes, I agree.
So this something. This is the disposable income of the parent, right?
Yes, that's their shocks to their income. Yes.
Then it asks, that's predictive of the child's disposable
Well,
income.
the first one is the one I'm focusing on, the first line on this equation. This is their consumption,
Prediction of
their consumption,
the, does parents' income at 30 predict,
their consumption residual at age 50.
yeah, or in the second panel, their income at age. So.
Well, no, but the second panel are more on, it's a different test. I'm looking at child outcomes.
So that's available, so that relation there is not dependent. Because it's what happens when the parent is 30.
Making the decisions about the child.
Okay.
That's realized. That's the idea. But it's a non-trivial point. It really is. I mean, you do need to assume an element of rationality here, right? Okay, anyway, so that's the nature of the test, but we're working on the test. But if you apply that test in this setting, what we do find is something very interesting. See, in Denmark, there have been a lot of policy reforms. If you're aware, they do allow something called flexicurity and introducing into the labor market what previously were fairly well, highly insured labor incomes. And suddenly that became highly variable. And that's true for both high school and for all other dimensions of college. Plus, there's the uncertainty that comes over the life cycle associated with a bunch of shocks. So even though more educated people have higher earnings and they generally don't suffer unemployment as much, there's a lot of heterogeneity, of unpredictability about where they're going to end up in the lifetime outcomes. The random growth, the growth curve of their future income is not that well settled when child is going to be. So that's the measure of uncertainty. It's just an example. So let me just talk again, something we talked about before, but it's relevant too. And the present value measure will allow us to capture it, is we can look at the distribution of years of schooling. So if you think about the goal is to essentially measure the father and measure the son at the same age and use that as a measure of the IGE, you can see that, for example, whole cohort changes in both mother, daughter, father, son ages in terms of years of schooling. If you look, for example, at key life events like age of first marriage or cohabitation in this case, timing of events having to do with the age at first birth. The later cohorts, we know that there's a lot shift to the right of these distributions. Namely, the kids are being, if they're born at all, are being born later. College has increased a lot, and marriage relationships are formed much later, and so forth. And so the age of completion of the highest degree, very different between mother and daughter, but also between father and son. So these are factors we need to take into account. What's that?
Ranks there,
What do we do with ranks?
to the distribution of age of marriage.
What about ranks?
Well, so, yes,
I mean,
the whole distribution shifts.
right, exactly.
Is it the case that an early marrying father predicts an early marrying son within the?
No, I'm not getting to that. No, I'm just giving you a demographic fact. I'm not forecasting the age at which my son will marry. That is not what this is designed to capture. No. I mean, that should be part of the full calculation on the welfare. And you've pointed out a weakness in the measure we have for the child. We are assuming something about stability, but we do follow the children far into the life cycle. So some of this is not a question of predicting, right? So we do know not only the father's state, the parent's state, but also the children into their 30s or so. So we do have some predictability here. And these are the non-stationarities in income, which we've seen before in many cases. So let me just give you an example in terms of these different standard comparisons that come from the Danish registered data. And so we can look at the correlations here that are used. For example, the measure we're going to use of expected lifetime wealth and expected PDV, we can see that wage income, and going back going back here to disposable income. Yeah, take a look at disposable income, which frequently is used in this literature. We can see it's correlated with realized lifetime wealth. It's correlated with realized PDV. It's correlated with, but there's a lot of variation. And even household consumption, which is frequently used as a measure of permanent income, is not that well correlated with these measures. So these measures are really capturing something very different. And I think the lifetime is. So that's one thing. Secondly, let me just give you a sense of how these measures, without getting into an IGE yet, without using anything, let me just look at how these different lifetime measures are predicting, for example, children's outcomes. So one way to measure the importance of these lifetime measures is how well they're predicting things like the child's test score. So one other dimension, by the way, is a lot of the early literature focused on father and son. And we know there's a very strong, a lot of assortative mating, but in addition to that, that the family unit is what's relevant in forming this. And we'll talk about fractured family units in a second. But what we're getting then is we can see, as you go across, just say the father-son correlations, you can see that they're very strong. If you look at the realized PDV and the realized lifetime wealth, but even stronger for the expected lifetime wealth the children are making. That's what's being planned on. That's what decisions are being made on. What's realized can be good or bad news, but if it comes after the fact of the decision, it's not very important. And these decisions are made in the relatively late, to the teenage years, I would say. Get a similar pattern in lifetime attainment. Oh, sure, please, yeah.
If one thing that can happen is there can be a policy intervention.
Yes.
Is trying to improve social mobility, and it will take you, suppose that's the only thing that happens, it takes you from the expected to the actual, because the only shock is the policy shock.
Policy shock, expecting, revising your income?
Policy shock is trying to address social mobility.
Right, okay, yes.
In your expected lifetime measure, that wouldn't be there because, or you just take a distribution over that, you wouldn't know it actually occurred.
Right.
In the actual data, i.e. the
realized version
there, and you see a higher social mobility, which possibly, as you find here, if that was due to a policy, now that's a measure that's important, right?
It is. We do want to account for policy.
About making and how that's
exactly. The parents are making a decision today based on their resources and their expectation.
How policy then are affecting that social.
You have a good point, but right now, what I'm assuming, no, very good point. I agree. But that policy has to occur pretty rapidly after I'm forming this decision. If it's something like a test score, I mean, it's not a 50-year later thing that happens. This policy is happening now.
For a lot of metric social mobility, it's actually what's happened after the policy is being.
So if there's some other, I wouldn't know if that's so important on these particular measures, but I agree with you. In things like wealth and things having to do with a number of policies about health and so forth. Yes, I completely agree. No, but that gets to the question, which is non-trivial, which is how do I form my expectation of what those future policy changes would be? And that's really relevant in Denmark, where there were a lot of talk about flexicurity for about 10 years or so, trying to reform, and the reforms were made. And so then the question became, well, when did the agents really act on it, and how were they learning about it? And we haven't really fully resolved that question in this. But that's a good question.
If the Danish reacted, oh, look, this is way too little social mobility you found, what they would be thinking of is the sequence of policies that also were enacted.
Right, but that would be, it could take down. No, what I'm suggesting though is that would be kind of like a transfer policy to later ages, which is conceptually different from the earnings policy that we're considering. But you're right. There are a sequence of outcomes where this could be done, and the expectation, and it's a good point. We just haven't really developed it to the generality you want, but it's absolutely right. But who has? I mean, I would ask that as a question. When we think about the sequence of what future policies would be, typically we take, the notion of the Congressional Budget Office, right? Scoring, we fix exactly what the policy has been in the last 10 years, and we rarely do projections on those policies. So how would you project a Trump, for example, or project a reformer in Denmark, a comparable reformer?
Yes. Do you want ex ante thing? Sure, doing.
But I think for the decision making, I think you want ex ante for the decisions that affect investment in the child at that time. But if I'm going to look at realized choices, go ahead, please, yeah.
Yeah, just you said it early on that some models of intergenerational mobility is more about the direct transmission of human capital, either like biological or some other direct effect, but then you're talking more about investments based on what the parents know.
These particular outcomes, yeah, but we're also going to look at things like crime and many other aspects of parenting and environments, yeah.
Yeah, I think, you can try to distinguish, or can you distinguish between, the forecast about income that people have versus that, your thing is a better measure of the underlying human capital of the parents sometimes.
Well, no, we have a measure, we're trying to come up with a measure of what the resources of the parents are perceived to be, they perceive to be as of the date that it seems to be relevant for investing in the child. That's going to evolve with age. So these things will be updated year by year by year. So if the father gets a shock in income and there's some, then I would actually want, we do
I guess the
update.
answer to the question is yes, you are more focused on the resources, not the direct human capital transmission in general.
Well, I mean, it's there.
Um,
Yeah, no, you're asking for, do I have a production function? I'm estimating the answer is no. What I am doing is I'm looking at what the relationship is as a result of that. So I'm thinking about what the investments are that go into that production function. And these are determinants. If we look at the value function, these are the resources that are essentially would give me the policy function, I think, that I would use for investment, right?
Okay.
Is that, okay, that's clear, okay. So we do find that these lifetime resources are highly predictive on a lot of different reading scores. So let me just skip on here. And we can also see it for other things like education, crime, and fertility. So let me just give you, since I guess I'm running out of time before I started, so that's too bad. But the intergenerational elasticities. This is literally, if we just take these measures that are reported in the literature, and remember the distinction between a family measure and a measure that's actually due to the father alone, given that the father's measure has been the traditional in many earlier literatures. What we can see is that we use things like wage income, and we look at measures of wage income, say averaged over a few years to avoid various kinds of measurement error issues. What we see is that expected lifetime wealth, that the IGE, and this is now the parent's expected lifetime wealth on the child's expected lifetime wealth. And no, the parent's realized wealth versus the expected lifetime wealth of the child. And what we find is very strong relationships that get stronger and stronger as we are developing a lifetime measure. And so each case you have when the family measure is used compared to the single measure, there's a stronger IGE. But we also have another measure, which is that the longer lifetime measures are more powerful, that involve averaging over the future. And we have a similar relationship. Rank rank was used earlier. Everything is analogous here with rank rank. So I won't do that. If we just look, for example, of the traditional measures of the IGE, where we start looking at measures for these different measures of wage income and decompose it into a correlation between the father and the child or the child and the family, we can see that the IGE has gone up in Denmark. And we can see then that the component, a big component has been basically the change in the income inequality across those two periods. There has been a substantial change in income inequality, and that's an important measure. So we can look at measures now of other measures of how parents' income is related, or these measures of parental income are related to things like time spent watching TV, negative version of it, time parents spend reading, and so forth and so on. And we see a stronger relationship with the expected PDV than the actual realized PDV. And that's similar for many of the other outcomes, expectations of child's educational attainment and so forth and so on. So there really are strong relationships of these long-term measures on this. And it's not just a matter of averaging over a longer term. We show that when we do averaging of these measures, like the wage measure, the disposable income and the sort, it's that averaging is not what's going on in giving a stronger lifetime effect, okay? And also similar in terms of choosing neighborhoods, that we find then that PDV has strong effects very strong effects. But now the pattern is not as sharp on things like choosing neighborhood characteristics in terms of fraction of single parents, youth crime, and so forth and so on. So now the question then becomes, how do children's outcomes conditional on the parents' expected PDV depend on the earlier PDV? That's an earlier question. So we want to think of going within the life cycle of the child and asking, when the PDV is strong at one age versus the second age versus the third age, what is the relative influence of this age by age by age? We can't do it age by age. What we can do is our intervals of ages, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and 10 to 14. And what you can see is an interesting pattern, I think. If you look, for example, on these influencing the patterns, you can see the early income plays a very powerful role, if like a completed education, for example, but also the income at 5 to 9 plays a powerful role, and 10 to 14. So these are strong measures for the expected PDV, stronger, by the way, and over the whole lifetime child. So we can also then look at something that came up in the previous presentation. There's a big change, and this is Ginther and Palick have made a lot of distinctions. They did some work in Norway, I believe, on this question. And that is, as family structure changes, how do these IGEs change by family type? And what we find is that if you look at the first one, when you have parents, that's parents at 4, parents at 5 to 9, parents 10 to 14, versus other patterns. You can see, for example, the single family, blended. Blended is now where the parent is bringing two sets of children together. Parents have remarried, they bring together kids from a different form. That would be a form of step parenting, as described previously, but not defined identically. That you get higher level of IGE, especially for the present value of the child. This influence of the early years very much more important than the influence in the later years. And so that blending family influence is really the importance of the IGE in terms of the PDV is much stronger in those early years than in the later years. And a similar pattern for another dimension here. So the question then becomes, when we think about blended families and we think about resources and computing the IGE, how do we put these, how do we adjust? How do we account for the resources that each parent brings in to the family unit? And so one way, and I'm not saying it's the best way, and this is really a rough cut, is to employ a kind of equivalization of the parents' resources. So when parents are living together and it's in a stable nuclear family over a long period of time, we can then look at the income of the mother, income of the father, those would be the same. We get the family unit income. The family unit measure is just the square root measure, the standard square root measure. We tried other measures for family size, but and we don't really fully adjust for the income, for the age structure of the children within the family, but at least to get the number of children assigned to the mother and the father. But we also then, if I can find it, look at other family structures. So we look at the influence of the non-resident parent for children growing up. Now we know, so for nuclear families, this is what I just showed you. But for single parent families, there's a contribution that would come in part from the resources of the non-resident parent. And in the blended families, we have basically resources that the parent of one family would bring to the other. And there seems to be some influence that the parent in the blended family who joins with another family, his wife's family, say, is actually much more influencing the old family than the new family. But let me give you an example. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction, so it's not going to help. This is, for example, the influence of the household resources on children. And so we can see then that when we do this kind of equivalization measure, that non-resident parent and blended families, that the 0 to 4, the very strong estimate of the non-resident parent in the blended family. And so the excluded parent, the step parent in the blended family, much weaker role. And we see that throughout at the different ages. So there's a very interesting structure still to be examined. And I haven't examined it in the detail that needs to be examined, but I don't know if we can do it with this data. So depending on how many resources the parents have and how many children they have to spread it over, it makes a difference in terms of what the IGE is on the family structure, which,
So,
what's that?
so put two families.
Two families blended together.
Different families.
Okay, yeah.
Both have parents with higher degrees. Higher degrees.
Yeah, okay.
One of them is engaged in has low income because of the occupation they chose. The other one has high income because of the occupation they chose.
Right.
One is in banking, the other is in academia. Say.
Right, okay.
Are we expecting different child outcomes?
We'd
We're
expect
trying to implicitly say.
different manifestations of child outcomes.
So
You'd find, no, I think you'd, well, if you ask me the general question, you're saying within this model? No, but the gammas would be, we're going to show you how parental education plays a very powerful role in this transmission. That is the leading mediator of all this. I haven't gotten to it yet, but I'm going to.
Emphasizing income first, not.
Why? Because I started from a literature that emphasized income. And I said, well, you can do better than income and you should have some long-term measure of income, which we think is what lifetime planning is about. But then we say, well, we add to that measures of family education and family structure. And it looked like the single, go ahead. Yeah.
This kind of talks a little bit back to your earlier graph, where you were putting a lot of emphasis on expectations, which basically are driven by education and things like that, right? While
That's values. It might be more values than education, right? I mean, I have more educated parents value education per se, typically. You can see that. They're willing to spend more. That's been found in various forms for decades in the literature on educational attainment.
just saying that I think resources are a bit overplayed in this literature.
Oh, for sure. But what I'm saying is that's what the whole literature has been about when you look at the IGE and measure of social mobility. I think most of the recent work suggests strongly that these family structures, the nature of the values and so forth, I agree. But you will like the mediation analysis I'm about to show you, I hope. Maybe not. It's good though, to find you not liking things, because that way we can argue. It's fun. So anyway, so here's, for example, this is what happens when you look at equivalization of resources and so forth and so on. And how important is it to do that? Well, we do this. Now, I went through quickly what the equivalization was, and it's inevitably ad hoc, because I'm breaking these three different age categories of the children up into 5, 9, 0, 4, 10 to 14. And I'm just allocating it per capita for the kids that are attributable to that member of the family. But then the family units themselves can reform and reform. But I'm also allowing the family structure to change over the life of the child. And we can see that if I just start off in this form here, IGEs, looking at a IGE on nuclear family, it's pretty strong, okay, the IGE. But now when I start equivalizing, right, start equivalizing these resources and even get into other forms of weighting by those gamma factors that I showed you, that the IGE is actually considerably diminished. So when I do allow for what the resources are that are available, the IGE link is much weaker. Okay, haven't gotten to education yet per se, but I will. So literally, if you go from here just down to here, that's a persistent pattern. Whether or not we use the gammas to form a weighted average of income. There's some arbitrariness here because we really don't know what the full intra-families allocation is of expenditure. But at least this goes part way. But when we allow for this equivalization, and again, now looking at family income, we get a much lower level of the IGE, which I think is interesting when we do account for that. So, and we do that for all these family types as well. And so this is for disposable income. It has a similar pattern, but again, for disposable income, the IGEs are much lower. And so here, when you look at parents' education, you can see something quite interesting. That namely, when you allow for parents' educate, well, that's not giving you what you want. So let me go on and get you here. So we can look at the IGEs for different family structures, where we look at the sum of the parents' resources not equivalized. We look at the family resources equivalized with the number of children, with the notion that families which are broken apart for which the absent parent still is making contributions, or at least might be making contributions, and we just have to attribute that. We find some strong effects, very strong effects. And in fact, the IGE is very, very strong in the single parent families once we equivalize. So that's a very different pattern that emerges as to how we treat the resources that are distributed between the family. So the single parent family, but with a step parent, would actually have a very strong IGE, especially when you look at the income of the child 10 to 14. Okay, so anyway, so this gives you an idea of how dramatic some of these estimates are by equivalization of resources, controlling for family characteristics, and so forth and so on. And the relevant ones are the lower lines, conditioning on X, and including in things like education in X. So the IGEs do go down tremendously. And these are just how different family characteristics are affecting the estimated IGEs. And so we can see a pattern. It's not so dramatic. For example, single parent relative to nuclear and stable. The problem is the sample size getting relatively small. And we do see that the single parent, the structure, there is a parental effect, but it's not obviously the same across different age structures. And that's I think relevant. So let me move on to the mediation analysis, which we talked about. Namely, we're going to look at parents' education playing a role. But what we're going to do is ask the following, and this is kind of a chart that summarizes what we were saying earlier. So there's a lot of different conditioning variables going on. And here I'll just give you a path analysis, or if you want, directed acyclic graph, going from parents' education to the income of the child. And so the parents' education plays a strong role in the parents' income. That, I think, is what we know. But then these other channels we want to look at are, well, the parent education having a direct effect on child income. That has some effect, direct effect. A huge effect, though, is the parent income on the child's education, right? And and that's, of course, mediated by the parent education itself. And then the parent income having a direct effect on the child income through various transfers and through various kinds of investments. So the role of education is pretty strong, and you can see it's strong not only in parent education to parent income, but parent income down on child's education. And you can see a pretty strong influence too of child education on child income, but that's not surprising either. So the mediation analysis, and there's a comparable mediation analysis for the later grades, but it's just more complicated to show because there are many more channels of mediation. So the education does play a role, Costas. Yes, question.
So I guess with the Danish data, we have tons of additional potential variables, test scores, things like that.
We do. I was showing some of them. I went over them maybe a little too quickly, but yes.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think through how test scores would enter into this mediation analysis.
They predict the test scores. Those are predictors of test scores, predictors of a lot of aspects of educational achievement. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to think through, I guess, child education and test scores and things like that. Those are the usual human capital channels and if we threw in sort of all the usual human capital channels that we think are important for understanding intergenerational persistence, how much would those predict versus other potential variables?
Like income, you're saying, or?
Yeah, so.
I haven't done the full mediation analysis. You think of all the channels where you transmit values, you
Yeah.
invest in the child, you would do a number of different, no, we haven't done that. We've done these very simple calculations that are taking you from the parent's education into income, education, and so forth. But then in addition, you would like to think, like it was done in earlier papers, estimating a more general sort of production function of skills and so forth, but even including values, the value of work, the value of, social, non-cognitive and social skills. Yes. But I haven't done that for this mediation. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Really sure how to interpret all these numbers on the graph. I mean, what
Well, I'll show you.
sense of,
There you go. Yeah. It was just a bunch of partial derivatives, right? Aggregated up.
They're unit dependent, so
Not like using standard deviation assumption, using measures of things like one standard deviation increase, this, and then the other
can
thing.
you have some kind of, what proportion of the variability of, say, child income is affected directly by parent education, indirectly, and so on?
Well, there's a big residual. Don't forget, we do that, right? I mean, we're not saying we've accounted for genetic factors. We don't have genetic factors
The
here.
explained bits, or even the total.
Honestly, I should know that, and I don't off the top of my head. It's not, certainly not 100%. It's not even 50%. There's a lot of other components that are not explaining this. Yes.
I'm just going back to our previous discussion.
Yeah.
How am I to read this graph in terms of what we're discussing?
Well, these are the challenges that are occurring, at least what seem to be the main channels. I haven't computed an overall R squared. I had it and I just dropped it. I can't remember it. So what I can do is give you some kind of decomposition of the IgE. Like, I don't know whether this will satisfy you. This is the direct decomposition that we do in terms of these variables. So this would be like the IgE of expected PDV of the child. What we do then is we have the direct effective income, and we have the effects through education, okay? So that's the decomposition of the IgE when the parents' resources are measured. Whoops,
Yeah, that's what
that's what you wanted to get at. Yeah, but it's not the full story.
I'm saying, resources here.
But that's decomposing the IgE itself, the coefficient, into these components. And there's another component which I haven't done. So that part is unclear, okay? But it's not just an R square, it's a partition of this coefficient, right? Okay, so that's where the path analysis comes in. Okay, so also I should point out, even though there's a lot of literature that talks about this linear IgEs, going back to Becker and Tomes or rank, there's a lot of nonlinearity. So for example, if you look at local linear IgEs, just look at local linear regressions on disposable income, you can see, for example, the standard measure suggests there's a high degree of nonlinearity, and the local linear regressions for these disposable income measures or for consumption measures already differ rather dramatically. And so here you're going to very high IgE as you get higher and higher, and here it's relatively flat if you look at household consumption IgEs. In terms of our current measure of expected PDV and expected lifetime wealth, what you find is actually something that looks like, it's certainly not what you get from looking at disposable income, which is a common measure. What you're finding is a nonlinearity. If anything, it's dropping off slightly. The IgEs are high, so that's much higher than people think are true. But nonetheless, it is declining when you get to the higher levels. Okay, and that could be partly the welfare state taxation. If you look at absolute mobility, the traditional measures are basically asking, well, are you better than your parents better than the child? This is a measure that's received a lot of attention in the US. And with the Danish data, it looks like with disposable income, it's declining. Here, what you're finding is, especially if you look at income without transfers or even measure of wage income, the absolute mobility is not is low at the top. But if you look at the lifetime measures, what you find is actually something much stronger, much different, and that is that there is more mobility, more absolute mobility going up with the lifetime measures and than with the standard measures. And so if we break it down into components, this is disposable income. Let me see if I have it for, yeah, let me just do this. Oh, 5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to finish shortly. But these components do matter. And the fact of the matter is that there is, with a lifetime measure, much more absolute mobility. Okay. The other component that we make is, again, we haven't really emphasized this in this paper because we're developing better measures of expectations of future income. So we've been a little bit reluctant to push this too hard. But this is just a simulation in some sense, showing how, as we measure risk. So for example, in a full-time accounting of lifetime wealth, or even looking at wealth at a point in time or income at a point in time, we have two components of variability. One is uncertainty, and the other is forecast known heterogeneity among individuals. In an earlier paper with Cunha, we had published some 10 years ago or so, we found that those two components are both very important, and they allow us to essentially then measure how much of a welfare loss, in addition just to the uncertainty, the shock, the variability that comes from the uncertainty, how much of a welfare loss there is from that uncertainty. That's in addition to there's no welfare loss per se. You may be unhappy with a low level of income, but you're not getting any shock. You're dumb and you know it. Here's a case where you are actually uncertain, and the uncertainty itself is a source of welfare loss. And we can see this measure changes a lot, not surprisingly, depending on the measure of relative risk aversion. But for the Danish economy, the studies that we found from experimental work suggest that the CRA parameter should be around 0.67. So that red dotted line is what's relevant there. And therefore, the absolute mobility in terms of lifetime wealth is much more, much higher, much greater than what might be presented from just looking at realized wealth patterns and looking at the earlier measures of family income. So let me just conclude with a kind of a welfare calculation on where we're headed with this paper. So I realize it's a little bit rough. I've been going back and forth between two different papers and maybe I apologize for not being so clear about it. But what we can actually do is look across the college and non-college. And what we can actually see is that as we move across the cohorts, just father and son, with the father higher and the son lower, the lower stochastic discount factor is kind of like the marginal utility of wealth in the old Frisch sense. And this is a measure of welfare that we can see for, we have different values of rho. It's just what's being shown here. But what you can show then is that the later generations are better off, even though when we look at segments of the population, like the unskilled, when the unemployment insurance terminated and flexicurity clicked in, there are components of the welfare state that have increased, lowered welfare, right? They've lowered because they've actually exposed individuals to greater risk. When you had 100% replacement on your unemployment income, you were in a much better state in terms of your insured future income. But there are other aspects as well, including taxes. So our hope is to integrate this more fully and to bring into this analysis then the full measure of wealth, full measure of uncertainty, and explicitly model those credit constraints. Because we can capture the credit constraints. Just looking at that measure, and looking at the stochastic discount factor, that by itself, estimated one by one for an individual component, gives you a sense of how far you are from a perfect credit market if you know what the interest rate is and have a measure of discount. And that's what we're doing. But I don't want to show you that because we're in the middle for good reasons. But it to come. Invite me back next year or hope whenever you have another conference. So anyway, what we can do is find it. So let me just conclude. So it's a little bit of a jumble gone over different topics. One thing we want to recognize, the early years matter. And so we're trying to approximate the early years. That literature is pretty well established now. And we want to look at what the resources are available to the child in the early years. Those expected lifetime resources are important. It's a much better way would be to incorporate all the information that comes from the shocks. So far, when you look at the measures that come from the earnings shocks and so forth, as well as the unemployment shocks, we have data on what these shocks are, but we don't have yet, and even in this paper, and maybe never in this paper, but hopefully in this paper, a true measure of what's in the agent information set by asking just what is not predicting these future shocks that are going on. But we're in the process of doing that with many measures of shocks that agents are experiencing. But certainly it's not enough to just write down an earnings function and then take the residual and say, oh, the residual is the shock. It may and it may not. But even, Richard, in your own analysis, you wouldn't say that your innovations of that sort were measuring uncertainty and the true thing. They were just measuring transmission of those shocks into. So that it's very important work. So we're just trying to build on it to see if we can extract that. There's a technical issue, which I alluded to earlier, which was samples of this size. Remember, we have a test. Something is not statistically significantly different from zero. When you have hundreds of thousands of observations, you can almost never, I mean, this is a point that Ed Leamer made a long time ago. You can almost never reject the fact that you can almost always reject almost any hypothesis with the smallest perturbation in the data. So we are standardizing in various ways, correcting for measurement error and so forth. But I don't think we've yet found a decent information set. This is why I didn't build on it. So we do want to build a further model accounting for uncertainty and credit constraints, but this procedure actually does. And we can look at what the best predictors are of successful childhoods apart from just looking directly at the IGE and looking at which of these life cycle measures are most predictive of child outcomes that matter. And then the relative mobility tends to be understated, the absolute mobility overstated by understated. Sorry, I got it reversed. So relative mobility is understated relative to the sorry, I'm getting really lost here. Life cycle relative mobility is less than the relative mobility used in the current literature on these proxies like wage income, disposable income, income after taxes. But the absolute mobility pattern reverses that. And if we go back to the Danish labor market example, we can see in cases where there were housing reforms and where down payments were reduced, where children were actually, where credit rates were reduced, then where more uncertainty or some uncertainty was injected into the labor market because of the relaxation of social programs. In those settings, what we have is real welfare effects affecting different elements within the population. And I only gave you a crude summary measure of all of those. But to me, the final point, which is, I think, still staggering to me as an outsider of Danish society, is that if you look at a lot of the suggestions that have been made in the past about the welfare state, providing all this insurance and it's amazing to me that the US, I haven't shown you any US data, but in the earlier work with Rasmus, where we compared comparable measures of US and Danish measures, the US and Danish social mobility measures were actually comparable. And here you're getting a high level of social immobility, actually, still, with these lifetime measures. So there really is a lot of other role other than just what the welfare state has conditionally provided. So that's where I think we need to think more deeply about family structure and so forth and so on. And I think that's where I'll stop. So thank you very much.